Christine Hogan is a media professional who has worked in newspapers and magazines as a writer and an editor, and in television as a producer of news and an executive producer of current affairs. She is now the digital publisher of Australia's most read faith-based electronic publication, CAF News, at Church Resources. The author of 5 books. Her titles include Men, The User's Guide. The second book, a collaboration on the autobiography of one of Australia's most loved personalities, was completed in 2004. The third was The Veiled Lands, a woman's journey to the heart of the Islamic world. That same year, Look at Me Behind the Scenes of Australian TV with the women who made it. The commemoration of the Australian Film Commission's 50th anniversary of Australian television was published. The most recent book was A Whole Load of Front, Maria Benuti's memoir, published in 2011. She is currently working on a major piece of crime non-fiction as well as a historical trilogy. Ladies and gentlemen, Christine Hogan.
Hi everybody.
David Costello is a freelance journalist and volunteer worker who investigates refugee issues and the growing food security crisis in our society. He worked at the Courier Mail from 1985 to 2012 and was the paper's foreign editor from 1994 to 2012, writing numerous articles on international relations with a particular emphasis on Asia and the Middle East. Today he contributes opinion pieces to the Courier Mail and continues to write music reviews and a weekly food column for Fossicky. He's also the Secretary of the Queensland Branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, David Costello.
Hello everybody.
Professor Abdullah Said received a BA in Arab Islamic Studies from Saudi Arabia in 1986. He then joined the University of Melbourne and received a PhD in Islamic Studies in 1992. He's also completed a Master of Arts degree in Applied Linguistics at the University of Melbourne and was appointed as Sultan of Oman Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies in 2003. In 2010 he was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Research focus is an important issue in Islamic thought today, the negotiation of text and context, ijtihad and interpretation. He is a strong advocate of reform of Islamic thought. His publications cover Quranic hermeneutics, Islam and human rights, Islamic law reform, Islamic finance, Muslim communities in Australia, and Islam and freedom of religion. Professor Abdullah Said, ladies and gentlemen. Hanif Adeem is an award-winning author and social commentator who has written 7 books of narrative non-fiction. Her books include Caravanserai, A Journey Among Australian Muslims, Broken Bangles, published in Australia and India, The President of Pen, published in the USA, The Jihad Seminar, and Ali Abdul versus the King. The latest book On the Trail of Taslima has just been released. She's also served as a hearing commissioner of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission of Australia and is also on the board of directors of SES as well as the Deputy Commissioner of West Australian Multicultural Ethnic Affairs Commission. Hanif is also editor of an online magazine, Sultana's Dream, written and produced by Australian Muslim women. Hanif Adeem, ladies and gentlemen. And we've got our time, Scott. Scott Stevens is a very good friend of mine, and I love listening to him on Friday. Scott is the Religion and Ethics online editor of the ADC page, and I've messed all that up completely because I haven't got it written down, I'm trying to remember. And I apologise for that. But Scott is, you'll listen to Scott and you'll know that Scott is a font of all knowledge. Scott Stevens, ladies and gentlemen, from the ABC. I do apologise, I don't mean to be that flippant. He comes with a legacy of wonderful academic work, which I don't have a copy of at the moment. So this session is supposed to be on Islam and the distorted view, and we've discussed a number of issues throughout the day in different forums about what Islam is and what it represents and what stories we want to tell. So let's go to you first, Christine, as a Catholic, who David tells me there's rough stories in the paper because we just talked about pedophile priests. So your journey into the Muslim world, is that an eye-opener for you?
It was because I found that I had an incredibly distorted view of my own. And I went to North Africa at the invitation of the University of Sydney, and I was surprised, shocked and amazed by what happened to me there, by what I saw, the people I met and the experiences that I had. Before I went, I didn't tell my mother I was going because I knew she had a stroke and she thought I was going to Libya, which is where I ended up. And my view was, don't they want to kill us, those people in Libya? Don't they want to kill us? And I discovered people who were chivalrous and kind and hospitable and a whole range of things that I know are norms, that were just eye-openers to me. And I came away from that experience thinking, well, I was so wrong. And I'm well educated, I've travelled a lot. I think I was so wrong about that, what else am I wrong about? And I decided to write a book taking as the sort of tropes, the usual 60 minutes view of Islam and Islamic women, which are female circumcision with a veil, honour killings, and polygamy. So I thought I'd actually use those four in this journey that I've planned through the Middle East and North Africa. And I have to say that those things fell by the wayside, and other matters that concern women there, which were far more important. So it was the distortion I understood because I was subject to it as well. So when people say to me now, someone said to me yesterday, those people want to kill us, and I think, yes, but let's just move past the 6 o'clock news or 60 minutes or whatever, and let's just think about what people really do want. And it's not about killing you or opposing Sharia law here in Queensland, it's just these ridiculous notions. So yes, it was an eye-opener for me.
Christine, thank you. Can I just ask people in the audience to please keep their voices down? We can hear it up here, and it's quite disconcerting, and it's quite rude actually, because the people up here trying to talk, they're our guests, and we should be a little bit more receptive. David, the distorted view you would have seen in your many years with the Murdoch Press, some distorted views. Some you may have personally held, some you may not have personally held. How do you, as a working journalist within the Murdoch Press, balance good news, bad news?
Look, I just basically put the news in the paper that happened each day, but I'm a very much a middle-of-the-road sort of person, and the Courier Mail over the last 20 years has been quite a middle-of-the-road type of paper. I was able to write pro-Palestinian articles. I was able to write articles arguing against Australia going into the Iraqi war. Overall, the main thrust of the paper is pro-Israel, pro-business, and there'll be more pro-Israel stuff than pro-Palestinian stuff in there. But I sort of had a slightly dissenting view, and I was very grateful for the fact that I was allowed to express that sort of view.
Professor Zaid, you've just written the book, which is currently in publication at the moment, it was being published, about a new interpretation of Quranic thought, or the new interpretation, new translation of the Quran. How difficult is it in today's society to offer a different interpretation of a holy text?
Well, it's not so difficult in Australia, because I'm writing in English for an international audience. But if you're writing this in a traditional Muslim society, which is, say, Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or any other similar country, you will have a lot of difficulties in actually communicating some of the stuff I'm actually writing about. I'm actually writing about rethinking interpretation, new ideas for contextualizing the Quran in the 21st century, and that means dealing with a whole lot of new problems that we as Muslims actually face in the 21st century right now. Our social, political, economic, intellectual and cultural context is very different from the pre-modern period. The kinds of challenges we face right now are not exactly carbon copies of the problems that existed in the past. I write in English, and that means those people who read my work are familiar with English language, and probably they also would be reasonably comfortable, at least in engaging with the kind of ideas I'm presenting. In Australia, I should say, perhaps some Muslims who are rather traditional or conservative in their thinking on these issues may have some difficulties with the kinds of things I'm writing about. But I see this as very important for us, for our future of Islamic thought, not just in Australia, but also at a global level. We're dealing with our central text, and the interpretation of our central text is the key for developing our Islamic thought. So even though it may be difficult in certain contexts, I don't see any problems or restrictions on me in writing because I'm writing for an international audience.
Hanifa, your latest book is about Taslim Nasreen, who was a Bangladeshi writer who was, I think everyone in Bangladesh sort of protested against her because she said some blasphemous things, or they thought that she said some blasphemous things. And you sort of followed her around the world to try to get her story. How distorted, we're talking about distortion in Islam, how distorted was her story from the real truth?
Well, it was like a fairy story. Not everyone was anti-Taslima Nasreen, but it was happening during the Salman Rushdie years. And the men I called, and they were men, the Dragon Slayers, who tried to save Salman Rushdie all around the world, in Europe, in the USA, and in South Asia, they were getting nowhere. There was an impasse between their efforts and Iran. And along came, I called them the Dragon Slayers, because they were all out to kill the dragons. And I don't have to tell you who the dragons were supposed to be. They were the naughty Islamists. Some of them were real dragons, and some of them were imaginary, because there's a very strong secular tradition in Bangladesh. So I wanted to put the pieces together, and I followed her 4 continents and 16 cities, talking to the Dragon Slayers, and who told me we were enchanted by the goodness of our motives. And she was the female Salman Rushdie, and they could bully Bangladesh, they could threaten to cut off foreign aid and have their way with Bangladesh, whereas they couldn't get very far with Iran. So I was a literary detective, following her trail, putting together the pieces, and yes, trying to look behind the official story, because I feel a bit of an imposter up here, Yasmin. I don't write about religion, I write about people, and quite often they're Muslims. I'm interested in how people mow their lawn, worry about losing their jobs, fall in and out of love, tell their kids bedtime stories, rather than Muslims frozen in prayer. If I give offence to anybody, I'll live with it.
Scott, when you're editing your online portal at the ABC, are you conscious of having a balance? Like David says, we talk about balance, and we've spoken before about, if we write a pro-Palestinian piece, we must get the opposing opinion and pro-Israeli piece. Are you conscious of that, or do you just write what's well written, or you just edit what's out there, or what people are talking about?
Well, I think, the ABC has enshrined, they do have a particular view of balance, that, there really are 2 sides to every story, and if you have one piece or one perspective, then you really do have to balance that. On the other, it's always struck me, though, that really is a fundamentally distorted way, not just of looking at the news, but also looking at the world. And what it means in practice is that, and I think this is in many ways a symptom of the overarching ignorance of so much journalism today. That journalism has gone from being just a skill that you put on top of a knowledge base that you already have, how to write, how to construct an 800-word piece, to almost being a profession in and of itself. And I don't think journalism is a profession. I think you can actually write beautifully about a whole lot of real ignorance. And I think one of the consequences is that there are stereotypes that seem to dominate so much reporting. And I'd like to say that the ABC is an exception to this rule, but I actually think they're some of the main culprits. In the interests of balancing the equation, you end up putting 2 cardboard cutouts, 2 extreme examples of either end, hoping that the 2 end up cancelling each other out. It's always struck me that the best representatives of religious traditions, the best theologians, the best ethicists, the best public intellectuals don't stand on one side or another, but they almost cut diagonally across the received wisdom. And so that, for me, is really what I tend to place the premium on. It's not so much have I got one from each side, but is there something of the truth of the situation here? Is there something that actually reorients the way that we look at the world and the way that we look at public debate, rather than sort of a bob both ways?
Christine, when you went on your little journey, and which you didn't tell your mum about, what surprised you most about Muslim women?
The fact that they took me in and took me to their hearts with such warmth. And when I came back that first time and I started to learn Arabic, and I'd go back year after year and I'd have a little bit more Arabic. They were so encouraging, so loving to me. And I ended up with friends I never expected to have. And I've stayed in people's houses, on their farms, I've gone to their weddings, I've seen their hearts broken and their children born. And they've allowed me with candour and frankness and love to be involved in their lives. Amazing.
Remember, people, this is an interactive session, so if you want to ask a question, please let me know and we'll put it to the panel. David, when you're a freelance journalist now.
That's right.
Do you understand how the shackles have lifted? Are you conscious of the fact that you don't have a master that you serve?
Oh, very definitely. I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't have any money anymore. But yeah, well, I'm working for the Romero Centre, which is a mercy initiative, and I'm working with refugees. I'm working for Food Bank. Sort of finding out that there are a lot more people out there going hungry than I thought. I've interviewed a lot of asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, Iran, Iraq. Well, I've organised refugee film festival, refugee fashion parade, and a refugee art show, which is showing at the Mercy Heritage Centre at All Hallows School at the moment. So yeah, I'm free to sort of follow my own sort of interests at the moment, and that's great for me.
So why is it difficult for you to follow your interests under the Courier Mail? Could you publish a story on refugees and how well they're doing and how well they've connected?
Well, it would have to. It wouldn't be stopped on any grounds of ideology. It'd be stopped on grounds that that's not particularly interesting, and it's getting harder and harder to get into the pages of the Courier Mail because it's getting smaller and smaller, and sort of it's very difficult to get sort of those sort of stories in at the moment. Yeah, you can get them on the website more likely, but it's very difficult to get them into the paper.
Professor Said, I'm intrigued about your current book, or the research that you've done about retranslating Quranic text. How long did that take you, and what's actually involved in? Do you have to really have a deep understanding of Arabic and the Arabic language and the nuance of that language and what it meant at that time, the context of what it was meant?
So the book I wrote is not about translation of the Quran. It does deal with that issue, because whenever you read a translation, you realize that you're reading also an interpretation of the text. But the book is more about principles and ideas that you could use to interpret the Quran contextually. In fact, the title of the book is Reading the Quran in the 21st Century Towards a Contextualist Approach. A contextualist approach really, in its summary form, is this: that when we read the Quran, like the Quran, which is the most important text for us, coming from the 7th century, in the 21st century, we really have to understand the text in its first context, the social, political, economic, intellectual, cultural context of the 7th century. But the Quran was addressing that context primarily. Of course, it has lots and lots of texts within it that are not necessarily context-specific or context-bound. But there are plenty of texts in it that are very clearly addressing the context of the 7th century Mecca and Medina and Arabia in general. But when we actually read the text, the Quranic text in the 21st century, we really need to address how we're going to interpret those texts that were dealing with specific issues, specific context in the 7th century, and how we're going to read them, interpret them, and understand them in the 21st century. So the book is very much about the principles and ideas and justifications for such an approach. And quite a few Muslims would be uncomfortable with the idea of reading the Quran in a contextual sense. But the argument I actually present in terms of justifying that is, well, this is something that many Muslim scholars have done in the past. Even in the very first generation of Muslims, people like Umar ibn Khattab, the second caliph or Khalifa, had a range of interpretations of Quranic text which were really contextualist. And there are many other examples that we can find. So when coming to the 21st century, reading the Quran in the context of our own reality right now, we really need certain principles and ideas that we could use to do that. So my book is very much dealing with those ideas.
So why is it important? I understand why we do it contextually, but why are you the only voice out there? That's what I'm trying to understand. Who else is out there reinterpreting it? And does it matter that you're coming from an Australian viewpoint or a primarily Western viewpoint, as opposed to would somebody sitting in Saudi Arabia have that same liberty to be able to contextualise the Quran?
Well, I'm not the only one. There are plenty of other scholars who are writing exactly on this issue. Muslim scholars who are based in Muslim majority countries and Muslim scholars who are based in outside Muslim majority countries. It is a major debate right now. There's a discourse that is right now going on among Muslim thinkers and scholars on this issue. So I'm just simply contributing to that discourse. And I'm also not presenting a way of interpreting the text from a Western perspective or from a secular perspective. No, I'm actually doing it from within our tradition. I'm actually relying on Islamic sources. I'm looking at classical scholars who actually wrote on tafsir and principles of interpretation. I'm looking at scholars who actually did a lot of work in the area of interpreting legal texts in the classical legal scholarship. So I'm actually functioning perfectly within the tradition. So in a sense you could say this is something that is that emerged from within the tradition, and it's a discourse that is deeply rooted in the tradition.
But how difficult is it for you to get that information out? Because you were saying previously that there would be some difficulty, some Muslims would have some difficulty with you reinterpreting that into 21st century Australia. How difficult is it for you to having to justify that you've done it the right way?
Well, when you do any work of similar nature, you really have to justify your project, and part of justification is by going back to the tradition, and there has to be a certain connection to the tradition. But these types of works should be actually deeply rooted in the tradition. And at the end of the day, we are talking about a community of interpretive communities. Interpretive communities are something that emerges in particular contexts, and this is a particular interpretive community that we're talking about. They share certain values, certain ideas, certain norms about the text, about meaning, about ways of interpreting the text. And this particular interpretive community does emphasize the idea that when we read a text like the Quran or when we read Hadith texts, we really have to keep in mind the first context of those texts, and also we have to keep in mind the context through which these texts came to us, and we have to keep in mind the context in which we function right now. Your work has to be deeply rooted in the tradition. If it is not deeply rooted in the tradition, it doesn't become legitimate. The legitimacy is partly authoritativeness of what you're doing, and also connection to the tradition. And works like these must be there. And as far as the difficulties I'm having, I really don't have any difficulty in writing about this and publishing them. As I said earlier on, I'm publishing with major international publishers. I'm writing in English language. Yes, if I'm writing a text like this in Arabic and trying to publish in certain Muslim majority countries, some parts of the text could be questioned, or are you on the right track, or are you really moving away from our classical tradition and the like. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm actually based in Australia. I work with Arabic language. I was trained in Arabic and Islamic studies. I don't have any difficulty with that. But I'm writing for an international audience. There are a lot of Muslim students and scholars who write my work, who read my work, and a lot of my books are actually used by the Muslims and others in teaching Quranic studies, Islamic studies, and the like. So for someone like me based in Australia, I'm not really just speaking to an Australian audience, or I'm not bringing just an Australian perspective. I'm actually looking at these as a global issues. I'm speaking to a global audience. And there are plenty of people who are actually interested in this. There are plenty of people who don't want to anything to do with this also.
Hanifa, in your book about Taslim and Nazreen, there would be a lot of uneducated people in Bangladesh that probably never read or heard even what Taslima had said or was reported to have said, but jumped on the Islamist bandwagon anyway.
No, I don't think so. At the time, she'd been writing columns for newspapers for years. She'd been shocking people and delighting some of the feminists, and people would read Taslima's naughty, naughty, depraved, sexually vivid columns over their breakfast. But they certainly didn't get out and march against her. None of that happened. So there was a remarkable tolerance, if you like, towards her. I think people forget that. Bangladesh may have changed now a great deal because there are madrasas there, and the madrasas are funded from the Saudis, and poorer people send their kids there. But if we're talking about the 1990s, that was not the case. So what did she do wrong? Why did it change when it was, you know, that naughty, naughty Taslima? What changed was, on her way back from Paris, she dropped into Calcutta, India, and gave an interview where she said that the Quran should be revised.
Which is what Abdullah Said's doing, isn't he?
Not really.
Well, I don't... Well, we have to watch out for a fatwa, Abdullah. Anyway, India wanted to embarrass Bangladesh at the time, and so and her publishers were Indian publishers, so the news got back to Bangladesh that, my God, help us, Taslima said the Quran should be revised, and the word got out to the media. There is, by the way, no blasphemy act in Bangladesh. There is an old colonial law that talks about it being breaking the law is to injure anybody's religious sentiments. That goes back to the British. But as I said, Salman Rushdie wasn't getting anywhere. We had all of these things. She did have a fatwa pronounced against her by a very small, obscure group called the Soldiers of Islam, who were up in the north in Sylhet, who later said, no, we didn't give her a fatwa. By the way, I've been trying to get a fatwa for years because I believe it does wonders for your print run. But, you know, I can't talk any of the mullahs in Australia into giving me one. So, no, it was a bit of a fairy story, but she doesn't have a happy life, and she didn't deserve to, you know, be forced to live in self-exile. And it's a very complex story, very complex indeed.
And I'm assuming that the threats were very serious to her.
Not originally, but after about a month or so, who could tell? There could always be some nut out there who thought he'd be doing the right thing, make a name for himself. So it had to be taken seriously, and that's why she left at midnight and ended up in Sweden.
Scott, in your editing of your page for the ABC, do we have is there a group of Muslim thinkers, idealists, intellectuals out there that connect with the non-Muslim community?
Yes, absolutely, and this I think has been one of the real delights for me. There seems to be this idea that almost exists unquestioned within so much of the Western media, that as soon as you put on religious glasses, or as soon as you look at the world from the perspective of one's faith, what one believes to be true about God and creation, then somehow that gives a distorted picture of reality. And so being irreligious isn't adopting a different point of view, but it's simply taking off a set of blinders or a set of blinkers. In other words, by being irreligious, one looks at the world the way things are. That's what I seem to be a very distorted view of the world. Those who adopt a fundamentally secular view of the world, it seems to me, are adopting a position that puts on blinkers and blinders every bit as much as real as the most entrenched religious adherent. And so I think one of the things that's been very interesting for me is to try to encourage writers from across the spectrum, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, not to accept the defensive position that so much of the media has forced them to adopt, that the only way that you can get some credibility in public is by apologizing or by saying, I'm not one of those, I'm not one of these, I'm not a pedophile, I'm not an extremist, I'm not whatever. I mean, that, there's no, I would almost say that there's no worse fate for a religious writer, for someone who professes a very real and a very deep faith, than to be forced to apologize for their religion from the outset in order to be taken seriously. And so one of the things I always wanted to do, back at the very beginning when I was first planning this idea with the ABC, was not to get the usual suspects, not to get the apologists, or the people who feel that they have to justify their faith to a secular audience, but rather to take people who are deliberately unapologetic, who believe that the world one day will be called to repentance and will be called to faith. And if that's true, then it seems to me that changes the way that we talk about politics and public ethics and morality. In other words, one begins with God, and then one goes on from there. And so I've been completely delighted for the likes of two people who've become very, very dear friends, Tariq Ramadan. But the one who's meant more to me than anyone else, I'll confess, is Khaled Abu al-Fadl, professor of jurisprudence and human rights at UCLA. A figure of tremendous moral authority and blistering intelligence, who is the least apologetic person I know. And I think that there's been the way that Khaled Abu al-Fadl in particular has been able to unfoot and question at a very deep level, not just much of the received wisdom about Islam, but also the way in which the West conducts itself. The fact that they've received such enormous audiences through the ABC has been a complete delight to me.
Christine, your online magazine, Catholic News, what sort of wider audience do you have that reads that? Well, and is it something that you're pitching to the wider audience?
Well, our remit is to, we're an aggregated news service. So our remit is to gather stories about Catholics and Catholicism from home and around the world. And they're stories that probably people might not have seen in the mainstream media. We pick up from a whole range of sources. So I'm absolutely astonished by our readership because of the breadth of it and where it comes from. I mean, it comes from West Africa, it comes from the East Coast of America, it comes from the Philippines. It's all over the place. People are in fact sometimes not Catholics, but are interested in matters of faith. So we do the job that we can do with our remit. And
Is that primarily Christian faith?
yes, Debbie, the editor of Institute of Catholics is Jewish, because in fact there was a great fight going on when I joined the organisation between the older style restorationists and the newer style liberals. And because I had an editor-in-chief who was in fact Catholic, who was seen to have a particular view of the world, and he wasn't accepted by half the church in Australia, I thought, well, let's fix this. And I got someone with no skin in the game who had all the skills that were needed to do it. And he just had to have an overlay of the understanding. So I'm actually not Catholic. I'm an Anglo-Catholic, which is a bit much for a cardinal to be sometimes. So we have a particular view of the world that's not hostage, I don't think, to any particular view. But given my interest, particularly in Islam, it's we try to. Michael's always trying to find stories with a Jewish Catholic bent, and I'm always trying to find stories with a Muslim Catholic bent. So we do quite well sometimes.
David, when you're writing for major metropolitan daily,
You'll get it back.
we asked you the question before Mr. Murdoch actually rings you and said, when you're writing in the paper.
No, he doesn't. I'm not that important. Maybe I could just talk about things that the media could do better. I mean, I've talked to local Islamic leaders here, and one of the things that he doesn't like and I disagree with is something happens, say the Boston bombing, say the guy who killed a soldier in London, they sort of bring up local Muslims and say, what are you going to say about that? Do you condemn that? Do you support that? Like, it's got nothing, what's happened there has got nothing to do with peaceful Muslim community in Brisbane. And you really shouldn't put those sort of questions.
I agree with you, and
Yeah.
I got interviewed both times. Actually, I asked to be interviewed. Sorry, they asked me. They rang me and said, "What do you think about that?" I said, "What's going to do with Brisbane? Where's the connection?" So I refused. It's the first time ever I refused interviews, but I refused on that because I just couldn't see the purpose.
I also think that the best way for Muslims to counter the PR problems that they've got, and they do have PR problems which go back 15 years, 9/11, bombings in London, you mentioned Salman Rushdie. I mean, there's also the trials in Sydney and in Melbourne. The best way to beat that is to go mainstream, get in the media, tell positive stories. You had Muhammad Abdullah on Q&A this year, which was very positive. I think run for council, run for parliament, it was like 30 years ago that Asians were the outsiders and Pauline Hanson and John Howard was worried about them. Now you've got Penny Wong as the finance minister, there are Muslims, there are Asians all over the media. Once you stop being the outsider and come into the mainstream, things get a whole lot better, and I think, yeah.
Scott, we assume that those that listen to the ABC or read the online portals or whatever are a little bit more intellectual than the rest of us lay people. But you must have writers that write things on there that the rat bags attract. How do the rat bags, why do the rat bags be read the ABC online through to the next page?
Well, you see, this is very interesting to me because I wouldn't quite classify them as rat bags, but I've always thought, any religion worth its salt holds two things together. And one is a very, very deep intellectual conversion, that the way in which one thinks and the way in which one looks at the world is fundamentally challenged from top to bottom. But faith isn't an intellectual exercise fundamentally. Faith is a series of habits and practices. It's forms of worship. It's the cycles that carry you through the year. Anyone who tries to live their life religiously, purely intellectually, I think is really selling themselves short. And that's why, again, every serious religious tradition has always thought that there comes points in one's life where it's the practices, it's the habits that you've gotten used to from years and years of faithful observance. They lead you through periods of real intellectual darkness or doubt or crisis. And so one of the things that always, I suppose, bothered me, and I feel that we could talk a long time about the problem with news cycles. The idea is that things keep coming around on this interminable cycle and religious leaders get called up to, one of the things that the news doesn't do particularly well is to break out of the news cycle and to begin thinking and talking about what it might feel like to be inside these religious communities. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is to include reflections, homilies, sermons, reflections from various times of the year, whether it be the beginning and the end of Ramadan, the commencement of the Hajj, to give an audience, even though a non-Muslim audience, a sense, this is what it feels like to be part of this spirituality. This is what being part of this great adventure of life and faith might feel like from the inside. And so I think I don't like appealing to rat bags, but I think sympathetic fellow travelers that might feel that spirituality is a bit exotic, I think that's a very interesting thing.
Is that something that you try to do, Christine?
I get a lot of rat bags, and I'm not ashamed to call them rat bags, and I'm tired of them. And they find me from all over the world. And they're abusive, and they're un-Christian, and they're just hideous. In fact, I was so glad we actually closed down a discussion board on our main site, and we migrated all the discussion to our Facebook pages. Because it was just a work health and safety question on the end. So I think that people say, you're censoring things. I go, yeah, that's what I am. For our sake.
Hanika, you started an online magazine called Sultana's Dream, by Muslim women, for Muslim women. Have we not heard enough about Muslim women? Aren't we all a little bit...
We haven't even started yet. I'm surprised, Jasmine, considering that you are on the advisory committee. No. The problem has been that on a range of topics, whether it's hijab, polygamy, Sharia law, the media, the boys usually will go and talk to the other boys, the presidents of these societies and the imams, and they're far more comfortable than going to women who have their own opinions and an insider's point of view. So that's what we try to do in Sultana's Dream. By the way, the name Sultana's Dream came to me from my visits to Bangladesh. Begum Rokeya Hossain is the great feminist icon there, going back to the 19th century. And in 1905, she wrote a novella called Sultana's Dream. And in this book, the women were running the country. They were the military, they were the politicians, they were the scientists, the bankers. Where were the men, you might well ask? Well, they were languishing with purdah in the harems. Now, that was in 1905, but you don't hear much of her as an international feminist. So I guess Muslim women who are probably in their own country not used to being called Muslim women, want to be authorities on their own lives. And I guess they don't always trust the ABC or not even the SBS. Dare I say things like that. So, that's what Sultana's Dream. And to talk about non-religious topics like childcare, architecture, the cost of Medicare and so on, just like every other person. And I think that's very important. And something else I'd like to say is that sometimes I have been concerned about what I consider the falling into the trap of victimisation. When there's all this Islamophobia around, it becomes very easy to circle the wagons, and everything becomes in defence of Islam. We need to show more empathy, particularly Muslims who come from societies where Hindus are in the minority, or Christians or Jews are in the minority. We need, in Australia, to really show that empathy and break through what I call this hoop of victimisation.
Just on another book you've written, and we'll finish up here shortly, Caravanserai, basically about the early years of Muslim habitation, I suppose, of Australia and how they were here. How ignorant, it's a rough word, I know, but how ignorant or otherwise of Australian people are they of their history and of their Muslim history?
You're asking me how do Australian Muslims know?
No, Australian non-Muslims.
Australian non-Muslims.
See, I always say to people when I give a speech or make a presentation, we never arrived here after September 11. We've been here for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand your research. What was your...
Well, this might come as a surprise to you, but I often get asked, where was I born? Where do I come from? And I tell people I come from a desert country. And they say, where? I say, come on, you guess. So I lead them through Rajasthan and all the great deserts of the world. Further south, I say, further south, until I finally tell them I was born in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia, which is, pretty much a desert country, I reckon. So there has been enormous ignorance about the who came here in the 19th century. They were not all Afghans. Most of them were from the Sindh, Punjab, Baluchistan, from India, of course some from Northwest Frontier Province and Afghanistan. They were collectively called the Gans. But I must also say that Muslims who've arrived in the last 50 years have also been remarkably ignorant about these early men who were not allowed to bring their families here, and because that was against the White Australia policy. And a few of them have actually said to me, oh, they were bad Muslims, they let Islam die out. Whereupon I look at them very sternly and say, you've got it easy, mate, you don't know how hard it was.
I agree with you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's almost under time. Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for our panel. Christine Hogan, David Costello, Professor of LSA, Anita Dean, and Scott Stevens. Thank you very much. This is our second and last panel for the Writers' Festival. We have a breakout session at...